everybody to the 33rd Annual Rock Gap Heritage Day. I'm glad you joined us to help celebrate our roots in northwestern Rockingham County. And then I also want to invite you to another similar function that we're going to have June 14th to celebrate Fulks Run Grocery Turner Hams. My dad, Garnet Turner, started the store in 1949, and it's been continuously in the family, owned and operated since then. So we're going to have some special music on June 14th, some prizes, and of course lots of Turner ham. So come join us for our celebration there too. Today, get this where I can read it a little bit better here. I met our next speaker, Chris Bolgiano, at the very first Rock Gap Heritage Day in Fulks Run Grocery 35 years ago. We sort of pushed back the groceries and put up posters inside the store. And Chris was there, and we collected, or made copies of about 150 original documents that were still in the community. And she saw to it that those copies went to the Special Collections at JMU, where they can be used for the generations of research. Now, Chris, in addition to her Special Collections Librarian career, which was 25 years or so, 30 years, she's also a writer, and that's one of the things that brings her here today. She's published articles in the New York Times, the American Forest, the Virginia Wildlife, and many other magazines. And she's authored 6 award-winning books, including The Appalachian Forest, Living in the Appalachian Forest, and Mighty Giants, an American Chestnut Anthology. Chris has lived for 40 years on 112 acres in Fulks Run on the border of George Washington National Forest. And she says on her website that once I learned to interpret what the forest was telling me, I found the past is still very much present. Today she's going to illustrate the various clues that can still be found in the forest and how the past continues to influence our woods and waters today. So please welcome Chris.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's really an honor to do a presentation at Rock Gap Heritage Day. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about my 2 favorite subjects, forest and history. I'm sure a lot of people have seen some or all of the clues I'll show as evidence of forest history over the last several centuries, and I'll be glad to hear from anyone who has information to add, because there's still plenty of natural history mysteries. For context, my husband and I, like Pat said, have lived in the Shoemaker River Valley in Fulks Run for 40 couple years on a 112-acre tree farm with our back border of the George Washington National Forest. And pretty much everything you see here in this photo is in the GW except the valley bottoms. In getting to know the area and its history, I've had the benefit of stories from many different people, some now long past but not forgotten. I've also interviewed various foresters who came to our property to help us write a forest management plan. Also, Virginia Tech has lots of resources for forest landowners. And as Pat said, I worked for many years in the JMU library, which really helped a lot to identify and get history books. So over the years, I've learned how to interpret some of these clues and to understand them not just as evidence of the past, but how that past continues to shape our forests today. Probably the most recognizable clues that most people have seen are old fences. You can still sometimes see old rail fences like these, though they are disappearing. In the early years of settlement, they were made of rot-resistant American chestnut rails into zigzag worm fences around gardens and crop fields to keep livestock out of them. European settlers brought over with them the ancient tradition of the forest commons, in which firewood, small game, and forage for livestock were accessible by common people regardless of what aristocrat owned the land. In and around the Shenandoah Valley, as settlers cleared land for gardens and crops, they turned out cattle and hogs to forage freely across the forested mountainsides to eat chestnuts, acorns, hickory nuts, all kinds of understory plants. They would set out salt blocks to keep the animals coming back relatively close to home. Remember today in places named Lick, like Salt Lick, near where I live. The city of Roanoke, Virginia, was the first name for it, was Big Lick for the natural salt deposits that were there. Shortly after we bought our land in the early 1980s, we brought our elderly farmer friend Claude Hummel of Singer's Glen, born in 1912, out for a walk and asked him what this odd-looking fence was. The slabs were axed by hand out of American chestnut wood and wired together at the top and the bottom. Looks like a pig fence, Claude said. Pigs, being hardy and hefty, were basic to the food economy of the mountains not that long ago. And in the later 1980s, I remember seeing a hog hanging over a kettle along Hopkins Gap Road. Don't see that too much anymore. Oak trees growing on the slope near the pig fence are roughly 90 to 120, 130 years old, and it was common practice then to graze livestock on the brush growing up after the forest was logged. So maybe whoever owned the pigs was being a good neighbor by fencing his pigs in on his own land. On the other hand, he might have had to pay a fine if he didn't fence them in, because by the early 1900s, counties were passing ordinances requiring farmers to fence in their livestock. Barbed wire was patented in the 1870s, and by the 1920s was being nailed to living trees as an estimated 4 billion American chestnut trees died from an imported fungus. Absence of this most productive tree in the forest is an invisible clue to disaster because chestnuts were a major food for livestock, people, and were also sold for cash money. Farmers were, of course, using wood for buildings, fences, firewood, other domestic purposes, but wood industries also started very early. Iron ore was being mined by Jamestown colonists in 1609, and mining began in the Appalachian Mountains by the 1700s. John Whalen, in his History of Rockingham County, puts at least one mine before 1800. Norman Scott, in his book Shenandoah Iron, calls the Brock's Gap furnace built by the Pennybackers on Oakwood.
Mike.
Said, oh, I'm sorry.
Mike.
No, the microphone.
Mike.
Couldn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Let me go back. Norman Scott, in his book Shenandoah Iron, calls the Brock's Gap furnace that John Whalen mentioned, built by the Pennybackers, Oakwood, and says it was built at the mouth of Turley Creek near Coop's Store in the 1830s, but the ore proved poor and it soon closed. Finding ore meant digging test shafts or trenches, and mining it involved open pits and or underground tunnels. And occasionally when I'm hiking in the woods, I'll see some old trench in an odd place, an odd shape, and I wonder if it's an old iron ore test pit. Iron furnaces were fueled by charcoal, which was made by slowly smoldering around 30 cords of 4-foot logs built into a mound around the central chimney. Topsoil was raked up and dumped on the mound to smother the flames and keep oxygen out to produce almost pure carbon, which burns much hotter than wood. By the 1850s, hundreds of iron furnaces along the Appalachian mountain chain ran on charcoal, including about 75 in Virginia, mostly west of the Blue Ridge. They produced iron for weapons, farm, kitchen, and industry tools, and millions upon millions of horseshoes. Depending on size, a furnace could consume 150 to 1,000 acres of woods annually using all trees. After about 30 years, the trees would be cut again, so hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of forested acres along the lower slopes of the mountains were cut repeatedly for charcoal. Coke made from coal replaced charcoal around the 1930s, although World War II gave charcoal making a boost on the farm. A friend of mine in Pennsylvania has an old charcoal hearth on her property, and she gathered up this handful of charcoal, which eventually might help fertilize the soil, but the hearths were so hot, they probably sterilized a lot of the soil beneath them because there was very little growing there. This chestnut oak, a different species from the American chestnut, but the leaves look similar, hence the similar name, is my husband's favorite hunting stand on a little rise above a creek with a cushion of moss in the center, a trunk for a backrest, and one in front for cover. Chestnut oaks are one of the few tree species that sprout from cut stumps like this one did. You can see a lot of these multiple stem chestnut oaks all around the woods. Trace a circle from the base of each stem and you get an approximation of the size of the mother tree. These multiple stems are clues to one of the biggest industries ever in the woods, tan bark. Peeled off the felled trees in the spring when the bark was most pliable, sledded out and hauled to tanneries that soaked or boiled it to leach out the tannic acid to tan leather. Before plastics, leather was pretty important. Before the Civil War, in the 1850 Census of Manufacturers, Rockingham County had 16 tanneries. After the war, our own Brock's Gap historian, Pat Turner Ritchie, documented raw hides from Argentina arriving in Broadway and hauled by her grandfather, Bill Albright, by mule team to the Lost City Tannery in West Virginia, where these wagons loaded with bark are going. He also hauled hand hides back to the Broadway Depot. And after 1906, when Harrisonburg lawyer and businessman John Roller opened the Excelsior Oak Extract Factory, called the Ooze Factory, along Route 259 west of Yankeetown Road, he also hauled barrels of ooze to the Broadway Depot. This 1890 to 91 ledger of bark purchases at Coote's store west of Broadway totals nearly 1,200 tons in just 3 weeks. Houck Tannery in Harrisonburg and Lost River Tannery, two of the largest tanneries in the area, each used between 8,000 to 10,000 tons of bark every year. About 35 years ago, I interviewed former bark peeler D.B. Wilkins of Baker, West Virginia, who said, "They about cleaned it of chestnut oaks around here. The peeled logs were usually just left in the woods." In 1924, a U.S. Forest Service ranger in Hardy County wrote, and I quote, "Since it is customary to leave most of the peeled timber on the ground, very severe fires have followed, and the little timber remaining is fire-scarred and defective," end quote. Peeling ended around 1950 when chromium sulfate replaced bark. Chestnut oaks are lucky not only in that they sprout readily from cut stumps, but by the early 1900s, deer had been hunted out of just about the entire region, so the sprouts escaped browsing. In fact, deer were reintroduced. And in a quick aside about deer reintroduction, this 1927 map of Shenandoah National Forest, which was renamed the George Washington National Forest in the 1930s to avoid confusion with the new Shenandoah National Park, describes a 9,000-acre deer refuge in the Brock's Gap area to restock a herd with plans for more refuges like that. I've studied this map, and nowhere is it indicated where that 9,000-acre refuge is, because they wanted to deter poachers. And those efforts really worked well, because we see a browse line in many parts of our woods, and we've seen wildflowers decline as deer eat them up, so they were very successful. Dotting our acreage and the National Forest are gray, lichen-covered stumps with a telltale straight-edge cut of a saw. You've probably heard of the burning, the Civil War campaign by Union soldiers to burn the barns and mills in the Shenandoah Valley, which was considered the breadbasket of the Confederacy. For many years after the war, farmers set about rebuilding, and they preferred yellow pine for lumber, probably shortleaf pine in this area. And to this day, shortleaf pine lumber is highly valued. These stumps look old, and the trees might well have been harvested as far back as the late 1800s, but whittle off a chip and the fresh piney scent is a whiff of Christmas. In 2019, I was at Penn State for a forestry conference, and I asked forest history professor Dr. James Finley if these stumps could have persisted for well over a century. He said yes, because of their high resin content, pine stumps can last a very long time. It's what makes them so good for building and why they still smell so strong. And due to that resin, these pines decay slowly from the outside in, so the actual trees were bigger than what the stumps seem to imply. Often the stumps are embedded in moss, as you can see, and it's my speculation that the outer ring of moss might give some indication of how big the living trees were. Recently, I was taking a friend for a walk through our woods, and when she saw this, she stopped short and said, "Is this some kind of modern art sculpture?" No, it is not. It's a home-welded winch that pulled logs up from the slopes and hollows to the ridge, where a cart or a truck carried them to a mill or a rail depot. The trees around the winch are somewhere, again, between 90 to 120, 30 years old, like near the pig fence. So this winch took part in the biggest logging frenzy in world history. After the Civil War, southern cities began rebuilding, northern cities began expanding as freed slaves fled the Jim Crow South, and a variety of European immigrants arrived. But it was one particular development that facilitated wholesale clear-cutting of entire mountains, and that was railroads. It was the coming of trains with Shay engines, and particularly the narrow-gauge dinky railroads that could crawl up almost every hollow that made deforestation possible. Timber companies, mostly owned by distant businessmen, operated with what one of the loggers at the time called a cut-out and get-out attitude. Accessible forests on lower slopes had been repeatedly cut over, but there were still plenty of huge virgin trees on higher slopes and ridges. And gosh, what trees they were. The ancient white oak with the family sitting on the stump was the biggest tree ever believed to be cut in West Virginia. That poplar tree filled an entire train. Timber companies took everything, and as the amount of wood at that pulp mill indicates. This 1881 excerpt from the Old Commonwealth, which was a newspaper published in Harrisonburg, described the local landmark of Mole Hill being timbered into baldness like Brown Hill already had been. The recklessness of the timbering, as the article states, brings to mind that cut-out, get-out attitude. This hillside along Route 259 shows some equipment that might be logging. It's hard to tell the resolution. I can't really blow it up. But that hillside, excuse me, that hillside is clearly as bald as Mold and Round Hills were. Historians generally date this area of deforestation in the eastern U.S. from 1880 to 1930. In just those 50 years, West Virginia went from being 95% forested to 85% denuded. And that's pretty much what happened down the whole Appalachian chain from New England to Georgia. It's estimated that less than 5% of the original pre-European forests thrived, mostly in areas that were too rocky or too wet to log. The clear cutting left bare soil, so every rain rushed down the slope, digging deep trenches, carrying away innumerable tons of soil. By the late 1880s, floods were causing millions of dollars in damages, silting up navigable streams, which were still important then for transportation, and drowning thousands of people, including the famous Johnstown, Pennsylvania flood of 1889 that drowned 2,200 people, due in large part to deforestation above the dam that massively increased the volume of rainwater and caused the dam to fail. And after the logging came the fires. Logging left lots of limbs, and with those large chestnut oaks left behind there was plenty of fuel. Equipment of the time was powered by steam from burning wood or coal and through sparks that ignited entire mountainsides. The Forest Service report on the land they purchased in the 1930s right behind our property mentions severe fires and lack of merchantable timber. A 1940 Forest Service report on the southern Appalachians describes, and I quote, "In the wake of lumbering operations came forest fires, great roaring conflagrations feeding on the debris left from lumbering, destroying mature timber and young growth as well, sometimes even burning down through the humus and soil to bare rock." We have plenty of old fire sign on our property. If an old blackened tree skeleton leaves char on your fingers, it may have been a living tree killed by a hot fire, which renders some trees rot resistant. So terrible was the damage from flooding and fires that Congress passed the Weeks Act in 1911, authorizing the 6-year-old Forest Service to purchase millions of burning, eroding mountain acres from willing sellers for stabilization and repair. Timber companies, they had taken everything of value, didn't want to bother paying property taxes any longer. They were happy to sell their land for a few dollars an acre. The Forest Service developed the fire warden system in the 1920s right here in the valley on Massanutten, and it was copied throughout the National Forest system. Also, the famous Civilian Conservation Corps opened its very first camp on Massanutten in 1933. And of course, there's several displays right here on the CCC camp up Little Dry River Road. Some years ago, probably 20 years ago, I was in the one remaining building on that property, a beautiful kind of barn-like building, still in great shape. Until World War II, the CCC worked on public lands across the country. They planted millions of trees, they built miles of erosion fences, they developed cabins and campgrounds and trails and other recreational amenities that we all still use. And you can still see the beautiful stonework culverts they built on Shenandoah Mountain still today. But millennia of soil building were lost in a minute, geologically speaking. Millions of tons of ancient soil were swept away, leaving gullies and trenches and rock piles. So the obvious question is, where did it all go? And the not so obvious answer is largely into mill ponds. As Mr. Jefferson notes here, mills lined virtually every suitable stream from the 1600s to the early 1900s. This map, constructed from the 1840 census, shows some 65,000 mills just in the east. It can be accessed by county and lists Rockingham as having not just grain but also sawmills, fulling mills that pounded wool fibers, and oil mills that crushed oil-bearing seeds like linseed. What all those mill dams did was stop sediment from moving downstream. But by about the 1920s, most water mills, the dams were abandoned or had broken or were removed. So what happened to the sediments piled behind those dams? Well, they started moving downstream, and they're still all moving. Slow, brown ghosts of fertility lost. We tend to think of a legacy as something positive gained from the past or something good left behind for the future to inherit. Legacy sediment is not a phrase that trips naturally off the tongue. Of course, there's a natural weathering process over millennia that breaks down rocks into soil, but that's not what legacy sediment is. This is the basic definition. Soil eroded since European settlement began. Erosion was worst on slopes, of course, because gravity rules. Now, there was erosion before there were dams, or there were never any dams, because even some Native American practices caused some erosion. But the pace of soil loss skyrocketed after Europeans brought horse and plow and clear cutting. There are many clues to legacy sediments. Chronic sedimentation suffocates the critical bottom habitats of streams and kills aquatic organisms, reducing the biodiversity that maintains ecosystems. Legacy sediments tend to carry phosphorus and nitrogen, and too many of those nutrients cause algal blooms and harmful bacteria, also killing aquatic creatures. And this will be ongoing for centuries because of natural stream dynamics, where trees fall in and create small dams that temporarily slow the flow of the stream and drop the sediments until the next hard rain. But there's also obviously contemporary erosion from agriculture and construction, runoff from fertilized fields and lawns and municipal sewage and industries going into the rivers, and all these carry phosphorus and nitrogen. So all of these sources provide the excess sediments, phosphorus and nitrogen, that are the three main causes of poor ecosystem health in the Chesapeake Bay, into which all of the valley's rivers flow. But I think the most obvious clue to legacy sediments is high stream banks. Some of you may know Dr. Carol Nash, JMU archaeologist. I interviewed her in 2019, and she told me, as I quote here, that she commonly digs through 3 feet of sediments to get to artifacts from the 1740s, and she attributes that to logging on the mountains. And below the level of the 1740s, 1 inch of soil represents 1,000 years of natural erosion. Now, the South Fork is a bit downstream from some of its headwaters in the Blue Ridge, which would drop some of their sediments as their waters slow when they reach the flatlands before finally merging with the South Fork. But Smith Creek is a headwater stream to the North Fork that rises on the west side of Massanutten. As you can see, a study by JMU Julia Portman measured the bank at 13 feet, not far downstream from the base of Massanutten. And that sediment has been there for a while, as the tree indicates. This 1912 report on 17,000 acres on Massanutten Mountain gives some idea why. It was done for the Forest Service before the service purchased those acres for the George Washington National Forest. 40% of those 17,000 acres drain into Smith Creek, not quite 7,000 acres. The report states, and I quote, "The exploitation of this tract began many years before the Civil War. The area has been stripped of timber and repeatedly burned, killing most of the young growth. Floods and erosions are unchecked. Slopes and ridges have been left bare. Farmers living near the tract say that during the wet seasons, the streams are much higher and floods are more numerous." End quote. Another study by JMU students found historical records from the mid-1800s documenting a minimum of 15 mill ponds on Smith Creek, with sediment deposits at 4 sites ranging from 3 to about 9 feet. A century of regrowth on the mountains now obscures the reduced fertility from soil loss, but to illustrate how much damage the severe loss of soil can do, the soil that developed over millennia grew these virgin spruce in West Virginia that dwarfed the loggers that cut them. Today, these spindly trees and monoculture ferns are all that will grow in that same area more than a century after it was logged, burned, and grazed. The hay-scented ferns there are native and are known to form dense colonies, especially on badly abused soils. Their roots help stop erosion, provide habitat for soil microbes like the mycorrhizal fungi that weave webs around plant roots to exchange nutrients. And without those fungi, many trees and many other plants simply will not thrive. A 1943 Forest Service report on the Virginia mountains noted that even on some of the better growing sites, quote, "because of fire or other passive uses, are of low productivity." Another clue to soil loss is trees uprooted by wind. We've had winds of 50+ miles per hour and more in the last 2 years, and the damage is extensive and highly visible. Hopkins Gap Road was closed briefly this spring due to wind and tree damage. You can just see enormous tree damage pretty much all along where Hopkins Gap Road runs west of Little North Mountain. And it's not just dead pines that are pulled over, but living pines and even some large living oaks. And when you look at the root balls, they're not that impressive, especially for the larger trees. We have a lot of downed trees on our property, especially on slopes, again, because soil erosion is worse on slopes. Scientists estimate that it will take centuries of leaf fall and root growth to restore better productivity to forest soils. But because of the our national forests are well on the road to recovery. And in recent years, we've come to understand how essential forests are against climate change. Carbon dioxide is the main greenhouse gas responsible for global warming, and trees offer the best carbon capture technology yet discovered. They take carbon dioxide out of the air through photosynthesis in their leaves and use it to build wood and roots known as hiding or sequestering the carbon. Then as leaves fall and trees die and decay, which helps to rebuild soil, those carbon molecules seep down into the soil. Forest soil is the largest reservoir of carbon on land, especially in the east, because hardwoods take in considerably more carbon dioxide than western conifers. And the older trees get, the more carbon dioxide they take in and store and sequester in their wood and the soil. Cutting trees and disturbing the soil around them releases much of that carbon back into the atmosphere. To conclude, it's always seemed ironic to me that the very destruction of the magnificent original virgin forest led to the creation of national forests today that function kind of like a modern commons, protecting and producing for all of society the headwater streams that flow into our rivers and reservoirs from which we drink, the clean air that we breathe, habitat for the many species of plants and animals that can't live in cities and suburbs, public access to hunting and fishing, camping, many other recreational activities, and now the carbon sequestration that offers us a hedge against the worst impacts of climate change. The 2 million acres of the combined George Washington and Jefferson National Forest are a backbone of life support for us here in the valley. The famous Southern author William Faulkner wrote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." So while our public forests are still recovering from their past, I feel like we're really fortunate to have them in our future. Thank you. I'll try to answer any questions. Yes.
There's an effort to bring back the American chestnut. Do you know what the status of that effort is?
Yes, in fact, my husband and I are lifetime members of the American Chestnut Foundation, the nonprofit that's taken the lead in doing that. And I'm sorry. My husband and I are lifetime members of the American Chestnut Foundation, which has taken the lead for decades now in first crossbreeding Asian chestnut trees, which are resistant to the blight, with American chestnuts to pick up all the American chestnut characteristics, but also blight resistant from Chinese. That's still ongoing. Recently, they tried to take an enzyme out of wheat, an enzyme that could block the operation of the blight, the fungus, and put it into chestnut. There was a problem. There was some mislabeling, and that has not worked. So as far as transgenic chestnuts, I think they're back to square one on that. We have some chestnuts that we got from the American Chestnut Foundation, and they're 15 feet high now, something like that. And then they die. And when we first bought our property, we had a few chestnuts. You could kind of see them spring up from the root, but they have died also. So I think eventually the crossbreeding would work. It's just going to take a long time. It's just many generations they have to go through. There's actually, the American Chestnut Foundation has a large farm in Meadowview, in the southern part of Virginia, down 81, where they're doing that crossbreeding. And I think you can go and visit it if you want to.
Tens of thousands of trees.
Tens of thousands of trees, yes.
There's a very large research orchard in the same near Woodstock. It's also open to the public.
Is that American Chestnut Foundation?
It is.
And that's the Virginia chapter then?
It is.
Uh-huh. Yeah, we're members of that too. Yes. Yeah, they've been pretty active, the Virginia chapter, having plantings and so on. Yeah.
But if you want to see mature chestnuts, it's pronounced the same, but it's spelled with Sesame. It's down by Wintergreen, and it's open to the public as part of the state part of Virginia Forestry Project, and you can go see chestnuts that are this big around there.
Boy. We drove along the Blue Ridge Parkway to the south some years ago and saw some good-sized chestnuts there too. And we notified the foundation about that. I don't know if there's been any follow-up or anything, but hopefully they're still there. Questions?
So locust and black locust, are they native to this area?
I believe so, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Good fence posts.
Birds, too. Wood birds, black birds.
Yes, ma'am.
So how has the procedure and rule process evolved? So when there's a large forest and loggers are allowed to come in, is the process much more defined these days so that you could take down a certain percentage at a certain time, and then you have to replant, or how is that regulated now?
Well, now there's a difference between national forests and private forests.
Okay.
National forests are federally owned. And the public does have opportunities to respond to national forest planning for any kind of cuts. That's not true on private land. And I've, in both Rockingham, Shenandoah, and Hardin County, I have seen horrible clear cuts, just done recently. Everything from the ground up killed. So and I know in Rockingham County there's erosion and sedimentation control regulations for private forests, but I don't actually see them much enforced. Now for the National Forest, if you get on their mailing list, and you can do that by calling the Bridgewater office and asking to be put on their mailing list, you'll get an email about, it's called a scoping notice, when they're starting to plan a cut or really any kind of activity, and you can respond to that. Then there's environmental assessments, environmental impact statements, and you can have access to all of that and make your opinions known. And sometimes they hold meetings. If you ask them, they can hold meetings about what they're doing. So there's a lot of input you can have on public lands, but not on private lands. And yes, the National Forest has a variety of regulations. They used to do very extensive clear cuts back in the 70s, but there was so much opposition from hunters, from people living around there, like an 800 clear cut in Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia was a real catalyst for that. And now the clear cuts are limited to 40 acres, which is still pretty big, but nonetheless, there are quite a number of regulations on the National Forest that, as far as I know, don't apply on private land. I'd encourage you to get on the National Forest email list because it's really interesting. For example, now they're spraying for what used to be called gypsy moth, now they're called spongy moth. And you can see, we saw last summer quite a few acres of denuded trees from the caterpillars of the moth along Great North Mountain. And so they're spraying. And that's a little bit questionable in my mind. They are spraying a sort of organic bacteria, BT, which affects only the caterpillars. But if they kill the caterpillars, this is bird nesting season. A lot of birds feed their young with caterpillars, so it does take out a food source for the young birds. Hopefully, it won't be too many acres that they spray.
Are there any organizations that invest in forest lands to kind of preserve it, lock it up? Or
Yes,
Nature Conservancy, I don't know.
Nature Conservancy is a big one, but there are others. There are land trusts. There are land trusts. Again, the Nature Conservancy has bought up a lot of land. We have a land trust. Used to be the Valley Conservation Council. What's the name now? They've changed their name in Stanton. They're based in Stanton. It's not Alliance for the Valley. I'm sorry, I can't remember their new name, but if you look up Valley Conservation Council, I'm sure you'll get their new name. Many states and often have more than one land trust, private nonprofits. So yeah, it would just be a matter of Googling, and finding what's the closest. But ours would be that Valley Conservation Council. They started up in the 1980s, I think. I was on their first board for a little while.
Does the state government own forest land?
Oh, yes.
School districts?
Oh,
Or
well, the state owns wildlife management areas, which for the most part are forested, and of course, state parks. Virginia has a lot of really nice state parks. So yes, the state owns. Somewhere I have a breakdown of the almost 900 million acres of forest land in the U.S. More than half is privately owned. National forests, even all federal land, national parks, national forests, BLM, Bureau of Land Management, mostly out west, national monuments, all the federal owned lands are less than a third of all forest land. The majority of all forested land across the country is owned by private people, both corporate, but more so by families and individuals. So our public lands are really precious for conserving the forest, since there are regulations and opportunities to help guide what's done there, which is not true on private land. No more questions?